He lost $1 billion deal that night because of a waitress. The story began long before anyone noticed her. In a restaurant where silence carried more weight than words and power was measured in tailored suits and quiet nods across polished tables. Clara Whitmore moved through the room like she didn't belong to it. Her black and white uniform crisp, her steps light, her presence almost invisible unless you were looking closely, which no one ever did. She carried a tray in one hand, a notepad in the other, her eyes calm, observant, taking in everything without asking for attention. Outside, Manhattan traffic hummed like a distant machine, but inside, the air felt controlled, curated, expensive. Then the door opened, and the rhythm shifted. Ethan Caldwell stepped in without urgency, but the room adjusted to him anyway. Conversations softened. Heads turned just enough to acknowledge him without appearing obvious. He didn't look around. He didn't need to. Power, for him, wasn't something to display. It followed him naturally, like a shadow that never broke. His suit fit like it was made for him alone, his watch catching just enough light to remind anyone paying attention that time, for him, was never wasted. He took his seat at a long table near the center, where 3 men were already waiting, their postures slightly straighter now, their voices measured. Clara approached without hesitation, placing a glass of water in front of him before he even looked up. "Sparkling or still?" she asked, her voice even, unshaken. Ethan glanced up, just briefly. Most waitresses avoided eye contact or overcompensated with politeness. She did neither. "Still," he said, then returned to his phone, dismissing her without thinking. But something about the way she didn't rush away lingered for half a second too long. Not defiance, not curiosity, just presence. As she stepped back, the conversation at the table resumed, numbers and projections slipping into the air like currency itself. Clara moved on, but her pace didn't change. Not when she passed by their table again. Not when one of the men leaned in, lowering his voice to discuss figures that could shift markets by morning. She heard enough. Not because she was trying to, but because no one ever imagined she could understand. Minutes later, Ethan set his phone down and leaned back, scanning the room as if searching for something to occupy his attention. His gaze landed on Clara just as she refilled another table's glasses, her movements precise, efficient, unhurried. A faint smile touched his lips. Not warm, not kind, curious. He raised his hand slightly. She noticed immediately. Of course she did. She walked back toward him, steady, composed. "Yes, sir?" she asked. Ethan rested his elbow on the table, fingers tapping once against the surface. "Let's try something," he said, his voice just loud enough for the table and the nearby guests to hear. The men beside him exchanged subtle glances, already sensing the shift in tone. Clara didn't react. Not outwardly. Her hands remained still, her eyes sharper than his. The game had just begun, and she already knew it. Clara did not move right away, and that was the first thing that unsettled him because most people either rushed to please or stepped back to avoid attention, but she simply stood there calm, steady, as if whatever he was about to say had already been considered somewhere behind those quiet eyes and dismissed as unimportant. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his fingers, now still his interest sharpened not by her obedience, but by her lack of reaction, and that was rare in his world, extremely rare. "I am negotiating a deal tonight," he said, his voice carrying just enough weight to draw the attention of nearby tables without sounding forced. "A simple one on the surface, but details matter, and I am curious how someone like you would approach it." One of the men beside him let out a soft laugh, quickly masked behind a sip of water, while another shifted in his seat, sensing where this was going. Clara did not look at them. She kept her focus on Ethan only. "What would you like to know?" she asked, her tone unchanged, not defensive, not eager, just present. Ethan's smile widened slightly. "Let us say you are advising me," he continued. "3 partners, one offer $20 million on the table, but the risk is hidden in timing, not structure. Would you accept or walk away?" The question hung there heavier than it sounded because it was not hypothetical. The men at the table knew that, and now Clara did too, not from the words, but from the silence that followed, from the way no one interrupted, from the way Ethan watched her, not like a joke anymore, but like a test. Clara glanced briefly at the documents spread across the table, not enough to be obvious, just enough to notice numbers, alignment, margins, things most people would not register in a passing second. Then she looked back at him. "I would not decide yet. She said simply. A pause. One of the men frowned. That is not an answer, he said quietly. Clara did not acknowledge him. Why not? Ethan asked, his tone now lower, more focused. Clara tilted her head slightly, as if considering how much to say, not out of fear, but out of choice. Because you are asking the wrong question, she replied. The table went still, not louder, not dramatic, just still. Ethan's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did, something that had not been there a moment ago. Explain, he said. Clara set the water pitcher down gently on the table, her hands steady. You are focused on whether the deal is worth $20 million, she said. But the real variable is not the amount, it is the alignment between the people offering it. She paused just long enough for the words to settle, then added softly, and one of them does not agree with the others. The man on Ethan's left shifted again, more noticeably this time, while the third man's gaze dropped to the table. Ethan noticed everything he always did, but this time he had not seen that coming. And how would you know that? He asked. Clara's eyes flicked briefly toward the documents again, then back to him. Because the numbers are consistent, but the structure is not, she said. Someone adjusted the timing without adjusting the risk, and that only happens when there is internal disagreement, not external pressure. Silence again, but different now, heavier, sharper. The faint smile on Ethan's face was gone, replaced by something quieter, something closer to focus. Clara did not fill the silence. She simply waited, and for the first time that night, Ethan Caldwell realized he was no longer the only one controlling the conversation. No one spoke at first, and that was the moment everything shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that could not be undone. Ethan's fingers rested flat against the table. Now no tapping, no movement, just stillness as he looked at Clara, not as a waitress, not as background, but as a variable he had not accounted for, and that unsettled him more than he would ever admit. The man on his left cleared his throat softly, attempting to recover control. That is an interesting observation, he said, choosing his words carefully. But speculation is not analysis. Clara did not turn toward him. She did not need to. It is not speculation, she replied calmly. It is pattern recognition. Her voice remained soft, but every word landed with precision. Ethan leaned back slightly, his gaze never leaving her. Then finish it, he said. If they are not aligned, what does that mean for me? Clara held his gaze for a brief second, longer than before. Not challenging, not submissive, simply steady. It means the deal is not stable, she said, and instability at this level does not show up immediately. It shows up later, when it is too expensive to correct. One of the men shifted again, more noticeably, now his hand moving toward the documents as if to gather them, but stopping halfway. Ethan noticed that too. He noticed everything now, because the room had changed, the balance had shifted, and he was no longer certain where the center was. Which one? Ethan asked quietly. Clara did not answer right away, and that pause stretched just long enough to make the question heavier than intended. She looked at the three men one by one, not lingering, just enough to observe. Then she spoke. The one who has not spoken since I started talking. Silence dropped sharper this time. The third man at the table stiffened almost imperceptibly, but it was enough. Ethan turned his head slowly toward him, the movement controlled, deliberate. You have been very quiet, Daniel, Ethan said, his tone even, but no longer casual. Daniel forced a small smile, one that did not reach his eyes. I am listening, he replied. That is what you asked us to do earlier, remember? Ethan's expression did not change, but something behind it hardened just slightly. Listening is not the same as agreeing, he said. Clara stepped back, then not retreating, just creating space, as if her role in the moment had reached its natural end. But the silence followed her, not Ethan, not the table. It followed her, because she had placed something there, something that could not be ignored. Ethan glanced down at the documents again, this time with a different focus. The numbers, the timing, the structure. He had trusted the alignment because it looked clean, because it felt efficient. But now he saw the gap, the subtle shift, the misalignment that should not have been there, and once seen, it could not be unseen. He exhaled slowly, not out of frustration, but realization. You adjusted the timeline without updating the exposure, he said, looking directly at Daniel. Now Daniel's smile faded just enough to confirm it. No denial, no argument, just a pause too long to be innocent. And that was all Ethan needed. He closed the folder with a soft, decisive motion, not loud, but final, the kind of sound that ends conversations worth millions of dollars. We are done here, he said. The other two men exchanged quick glances, already understanding what that meant. Chairs shifted quietly, the atmosphere tightening, not with tension, but consequence. Clara had already turned away, moving toward another table, her steps unchanged, her posture the same, as before, as if nothing significant had happened, but behind her Ethan Caldwell sat in silence for a moment longer, not defeated, not embarrassed, just recalibrating, because for the first time in a long time someone had not tried to impress him, not tried to challenge him, not tried to gain anything from him. She had simply seen what he missed and said it without hesitation, without fear, and that was not something he could ignore. Ethan remained seated long after the others had stood up, their chairs sliding back with quiet restraint, their voices lowered, now no longer confident, no longer certain. The energy that had filled the table only minutes ago had drained into something else, something heavier, something unresolved. Daniel was the last to rise, his movements controlled, but slower than before, his eyes avoiding Ethan's for just a fraction too long. And that was enough. It was always enough. We will revisit this, Daniel said finally, his tone measured but lacking its earlier precision. Ethan did not respond. He did not need to. The silence between them had already said more than any negotiation could. The men gathered their documents quickly, not rushed, but not relaxed either, and within seconds the table that had held a $20 million decision was empty except for Ethan and the untouched glass of water in front of him. He reached for it finally, taking a slow sip, his gaze drifting across the room until it found her again. Clara was at another table, now speaking softly to an older couple, her expression warm but composed, as if she had never been part of anything else, as if she had not just shifted the outcome of a deal that would have defined most people's careers. Ethan watched her for a moment longer than necessary, then stood up, not abruptly, not dramatically, just with intention. He adjusted his jacket, his posture returning to its usual control, but something had changed, not visible, not obvious, but there in the way his steps slowed slightly as he moved through the room. He stopped a few feet from her, waiting, not interrupting, not calling out her name. When she finished speaking to the couple, she turned and saw him standing there. Her expression did not change, not surprised, not impressed, just aware. "Did you need anything else, sir?" she asked, the same tone, the same calm presence. Ethan almost smiled at that, almost, but not quite. "Clara," he said, using her name for the first time, and that alone was enough to shift the moment just slightly. She paused just briefly, then nodded. "Yes." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, holding it between his fingers for a second before offering it to her. "I do not usually make this kind of offer," he said, "but I think you already know that." Clara looked at the card, but did not take it, not immediately. Her eyes moved from the card back to him, studying not the object, but the intention behind it. Ethan noticed that too, and for the first time that evening, he felt something unfamiliar, not discomfort, not doubt, something closer to being evaluated. "You saw something tonight that I did not," he continued, his voice steady but quieter now. "That does not happen often." Clara's gaze softened slightly, not with emotion, but with understanding. "It happens more often than you think," she said gently. "Most people just do not say anything." Ethan held her gaze for a moment longer, then extended the card again, this time with less certainty, not weaker, just different. "Work for me," he said. "Consulting, analysis, whatever you want to call it, I can make it worth your time." The words were direct, efficient, exactly what he was used to offering, and exactly what people were used to accepting. But Clara did not reach for the card. She did not hesitate out of fear or confusion. She simply looked at it, then back at him, and shook her head once, small, calm, final no, she said. Ethan blinked once, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone else, but enough to register internally, because rejection was not something he encountered often, especially not delivered so quietly, without explanation, without apology. "No," he repeated, as if testing the word. Clara nodded. "I am sure you can make it worth my time," she said, "but that is not the same thing as making it right for me." The space between them shifted again, not with tension, but clarity. Ethan lowered his hand slowly, the card still between his fingers, his expression unreadable, but no longer in control of the moment the way it had been before, and for the first time that night, he understood something simple and absolute. Power could open doors, but it could not decide who walked through them. The words stayed between them longer than it should have, not loud, not repeated, just there, solid and unshaken. Ethan lowered his hand completely, now the card slipping back into his pocket. Without ceremony, without insistence, he did not argue, he did not push, because something in the way she had said no made it clear that persuasion would not change the outcome. Clara had already turned slightly, her attention shifting back toward the dining room, not dismissing him, just returning to what mattered to her. And that was something Ethan noticed immediately. Most people lingered when speaking to him. They waited for a reaction, for approval, for opportunity. She did neither. Why, he asked finally, not demanding, not challenging, just asking the question. As it came, Clara paused, not fully turning back, just enough to acknowledge him. Because you are still trying to win something, she said, her voice quiet but precise. Ethan frowned slightly, not in offense, but in thought. That is what I do, he replied. Clara nodded once. Exactly, she said, and that was all she added before stepping away, completely moving toward the service station, her pace unchanged, her posture the same as before, leaving him standing there in the middle of a room that no longer felt entirely his. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze following her for a brief second before shifting away. He walked back to his table, now empty, the documents gone, the deal already dissolved in silence. He placed his hand on the back of the chair, but did not sit, not yet. Instead, he looked around the restaurant, the same room, the same people, the same quiet conversations, but something felt different. Not because the room had changed, but because his perspective had. He had built his life on reading people, on predicting behavior, on identifying leverage points. And yet tonight a waitress had seen through a negotiation faster than he had, and then refused the one thing everyone else wanted: his offer, his access, his world. He sat down finally, his movements slower, now more deliberate, the glass of water still half full in front of him. He stared at it for a moment, then let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but not quite, because it was not amusing. It was something else, something closer to realization. Across the room, Clara continued working seamlessly, taking orders, delivering plates, offering small polite smiles to guests who never looked twice at her. And that was the part that stayed with him, not what she had said, not even what she had seen, but how easily she had returned to being unnoticed, as if the moment they had shared carried no weight for her at all, as if it had been just another passing interaction in a long day. Ethan reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out the card, not to offer it, but to look at it, his name embossed clean and sharp, the symbol of everything he had built. Everything people responded to, everything that usually defined the outcome of a conversation. He turned it slightly between his fingers, then placed it flat on the table, not as an offer, not as a tool, just as an object stripped of its usual power. For the first time in years, Ethan Caldwell did not feel in control of the room. And strangely, he did not try to take it back. He simply sat there watching, observing, thinking in a way he had not allowed himself to in a long time, because something about her refusal had not closed a door, it had revealed one, a different kind, one that could not be opened with money or influence or strategy. And for the first time that night, he realized the game he had been playing was not the only one that mattered. The restaurant returned to its rhythm. But for Ethan, the rhythm no longer sounded the same. The clink of glasses, the low hum of conversations, the quiet footsteps across polished floors, all of it felt sharper, more deliberate, as if something had been stripped away, leaving only what was real. He sat there for a while longer, not checking his phone, not calling anyone, not trying to recover the deal, because for once recovery was not the point. Understanding was. He finally stood up again, slower this time, his movements no longer driven by urgency, but by intention, and walked toward the service station, where Clara was organizing receipts, her hands moving with quiet efficiency. She did not look up immediately, not ignoring him, just finishing what she was doing before giving him her attention. And that alone was another difference. He noticed people usually stopped everything when he approached. She did not. When she finally turned, her expression was the same calm, steady presence that had unsettled him earlier. Is there something else you need? She asked. Ethan shook his head slightly. No, he said, then paused, as if reconsidering the simplicity of that answer. Actually, yes, but not in the way you think. Clara waited, not prompting, not filling the silence, just allowing it to exist until he chose his words. You said I was trying to win something, he continued. What do you think I was trying to win? Clara glanced at him for a brief second, then back at the receipts, aligning them neatly before answering. Control, she said simply. Ethan let out a quiet breath, not defensive, not dismissive, just acknowledging the accuracy of it. And what is wrong with that? He asked. Clara set the last receipt down and finally looked at him fully. Nothing, she said, until it becomes the only way you know how to exist. The words were not harsh, not judgmental, just clear, and that clarity settled over the moment in a way that made it impossible to ignore. Ethan considered that for a second longer than he expected, then nodded once, not in agreement exactly, but in recognition. You saw through the deal, he said. You saw through me. Clara shook her head slightly. No, she replied. I saw patterns you chose not to look at. Ethan almost smiled again, that same almost as before, because the distinction mattered more than it sounded like it did. He leaned slightly against the counter, not invading her space, not trying to dominate the moment, just standing there as another person in the room. You could have said nothing, he said. Clara nodded. I could have, but you did not, he added. She met his gaze briefly. Because someone needed to, she said, then added quietly. And you were about to make a mistake you would not have been able to undo easily. Ethan looked down for a moment, then back at her, the weight of that statement settling in fully now, not as a challenge, but as a fact. He had been closer than he realized, and the only reason he had not stepped into it was standing in front of him in a uniform most people overlooked. You saved me money tonight, he said. Clara shook her head again. That is not what I did, she replied. Then what did you do, he asked. Clara paused just slightly, as if deciding how to phrase something simple, without making it sound bigger than it was. I paid attention, she said. Ethan exhaled slowly, and this time there was a faint trace of something different in it, not frustration, not control, something closer to humility, because the answer was that simple and that complicated at the same time. He straightened slightly, stepping back just enough to create space again. Thank you, he said, and the words were quiet, genuine, unforced. Clara nodded once, accepting them without reaction, without expectation, as if gratitude was not something she needed to hold on to. And as he turned to leave, Ethan Caldwell understood something that had nothing to do with money or deals or power. Sometimes the difference between winning and losing was not intelligence or strategy. Sometimes it was simply whether or not someone chose to pay attention. The night moved forward, but something in it refused to return to normal. Ethan stepped out into the cool Manhattan air. A few minutes later, the city lights stretching endlessly in front of him, cars passing in steady lines, horns, distant footsteps blending into the rhythm he had always known. But tonight it felt different, quieter, not because the city had changed, but because he paused on the sidewalk for a moment, not reaching for his phone, not calling his driver, just standing there as the weight of the evening settled in fully. The deal was gone, that part was clear, but the loss did not feel the way it usually did. There was no frustration, no urgency to fix it, no immediate calculation of the next move. Instead, there was a strange clarity, something he had not experienced in years. He replayed the moment in his mind, not the numbers, not the negotiation, but her words, the way she had spoken, without hesitation, without trying to impress him, without trying to gain anything from him, and more than that, the way she had walked away from it all as if it meant nothing, as if he meant nothing in the context of her world. And that was the part that stayed with him most. Ethan finally exhaled and began walking, not toward his car, but down the block, his pace slower than usual, his mind moving differently, not jumping ahead, not predicting, just processing something he had avoided for a long time. Inside the restaurant, Clara continued her shift as if nothing had happened. She cleared tables, refilled glasses, answered quiet requests with the same steady presence she had shown all night, but now there was something else. Not visible, not spoken, just a subtle awareness that the moment had passed. And that was enough. One of the other servers approached her near the service station, lowering her voice slightly. What was that about? She asked, curiosity slipping through despite her attempt to sound casual. Clara glanced at her briefly, then returned to organizing the receipts. Nothing important, she said, and meant it not as dismissal, but as truth, because to her it was not about the man or the deal or the money. It was about a pattern she had seen and chosen to acknowledge, and now it was over. The other server frowned slightly. He looked like someone important, she said. Clara nodded once. He is, she replied. Then why did you say no? The question came quickly before it could be softened. Clara paused for a moment, not because she needed time to think, but because she wanted to answer honestly. Because important is not the same as right, she said quietly, then moved on before the conversation could continue, leaving the question hanging in the air, without explanation, without justification, just like her decision hours later when the restaurant began to empty and the lights softened. Clara stepped outside, as well the night air cooler now, the streets calmer than before. She pulled her jacket slightly tighter around her shoulders and started walking in the opposite direction of where Ethan had gone, unaware that somewhere in the same city, he was still thinking about the same moment from a completely different perspective. And that was the quiet truth of it all. Two people had stood in the same place, heard the same words, seen the same outcome, and yet walked away with entirely different understandings. Ethan had lost a deal and gained a question. Clara had said a few sentences and closed a chapter, and in that difference something subtle but powerful had been revealed. Not everything needs to be pursued, not every opportunity needs to be accepted, and sometimes the strongest position is not the one you fight to keep, But the one you choose to walk away from the next morning did not arrive with noise or urgency. It came quietly the way clarity often does, without announcement, without demand. Ethan was already awake before the city fully stirred, standing by the wide glass window of his penthouse, the skyline stretching endlessly beneath him, the same view he had seen 1,000 times before, but this time he was not looking at the buildings. He was looking through them. His phone rested on the table behind him, untouched for once. Emails, messages, missed calls, all waiting, but none of them felt immediate, none of them felt necessary. His mind was still somewhere else, replaying not the numbers, not the deal, not the loss, but the simplicity of her words, because that was what unsettled him most, not complexity, but simplicity. He turned slightly, glancing at the reflection of himself in the glass, tailored suit, perfect, as always. Posture controlled, expression unreadable, everything exactly as it should be, and yet something felt off, not externally, not visibly, but internally, like a structure that had always been stable, suddenly revealing a flaw he had never noticed before. He walked back toward the table, picking up his phone, finally scrolling through the messages quickly. His assistant had already sent updates, options to recover the deal, alternative partners, revised projections, all efficient, all logical, all expected. Ethan read them once, then locked the screen without responding, not because they were wrong, but because for the first time they were incomplete. They were missing something he had not known to look for until now. Across the city, Clara moved through her morning in a completely different rhythm. Her apartment, small, modest, the sunlight filtering through the blinds and soft lines across the room. She poured herself a cup of coffee, standing by the kitchen counter in silence. No rush, no urgency, just a moment. Before the day began again, her phone buzzed once on the table, a message from her manager confirming her shift later that evening. Nothing unusual, nothing unexpected. She glanced at it, then set the phone down without a second thought. Her world had not changed, her responsibilities had not shifted, the night before had not altered anything tangible, and yet there was a quiet awareness beneath it all, not pride, not satisfaction, just a recognition that she had done what needed to be done, and that was enough. She took a sip of coffee, her gaze drifting toward the window for a brief second before returning to the present, the day ahead, simple, predictable, grounded in reality. Back in his office hours later, Ethan sat across from his executive team. The room, sleek, controlled, the atmosphere efficient, as always. Presentations lined up, data projected clearly, decisions waiting to be made. One of his partners began outlining a new opportunity, numbers clean, structure solid, everything exactly the way Ethan had always preferred. But as the explanation continued, something in his mind slowed, not rejecting the information, just examining it differently. He leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing, not in doubt, but in focus. "Stop," he said quietly. The room fell silent immediately. The presenter froze mid-sentence. Ethan looked at the screen for a moment longer, then shifted his gaze toward the people in the room, one by one, not rushing, not reacting, just observing, something he had always done, but now with a different intention. "What are we not seeing?" he asked. The question landed differently than usual. It was not rhetorical, not strategic, it was real, and for a moment no one answered, because the expectation had changed. The dynamic had shifted subtly, but undeniably. Ethan waited, not filling the silence, not guiding them toward an answer, just letting the question exist. And in that space, something unfamiliar began to take shape, not control, not dominance, but awareness, because for the first time, he was not trying to win the room, he was trying to understand it. And somewhere across the city, without knowing it, Clara Whitmore had already changed the way he played the game. The question stayed in the room long after it was asked, not because it was difficult, but because it was unfamiliar. Ethan did not move, he did not repeat it, he simply waited, and that waiting changed everything. His team shifted slightly in their seats, glancing at each other, then back at the screen, as if the answer might appear there if they looked hard enough. But it did not, because this was not a question about data, it was a question about attention. One of the analysts finally cleared his throat. "The projections are based on standard growth assumptions," he said carefully. Ethan nodded once. "I know," he replied. "What are we not seeing?" This time the silence felt different, less uncertain, more intentional, as if the room itself was beginning to understand what was being asked. Another voice spoke up, quieter this time. "The partner on the West Coast has not confirmed the timeline." Ethan's gaze shifted immediately, not reacting, not praising, just focusing. "Why?" he asked. The analyst hesitated, then answered. "They said they are still reviewing internal allocations." Ethan leaned back slightly, the same way he had the night before, the same posture, but not the same mindset. "Or they are not aligned yet," he said calmly, and the words landed with a quiet weight. Because now everyone in the room heard what he was really saying. The pattern was the same, the situation different, but the principle identical, and once seen, it could not be ignored. The meeting shifted after that, not dramatically, not abruptly, but in a way that changed the outcome. Decisions were delayed, questions were asked, assumptions were re-examined, and for the first time in a long time, the room was not moving toward speed, it was moving toward clarity. Hours later, when the meeting ended, Ethan remained seated for a moment longer. The others filed out quietly, leaving him alone with the stillness of the room. He looked at the empty chair across from him, then down at the table, his reflection faint in the polished surface, not distorted, just clearer than before. He stood up, slowly walking toward the window again. The city below, unchanged, people, moving cars, passing, life continuing exactly as it always had, but something within him had shifted, not his position, not his power, but his perspective. And that was enough. That evening, the restaurant filled once more, the same lights, the same quiet conversations, the same unnoticed moments. Clara moved through it all with the same steady presence, her hands precise, her attention focused, not seeking recognition, not avoiding it, just present in each moment. As it came, a new table, a new order, a different set of faces, none of them aware of the impact she had already made somewhere else entirely, and she did not need them to be, because that was never the point. As she placed a plate gently in front of a guest, she paused for a brief second, her eyes catching a small detail, a misplaced glass, a subtle hesitation in a conversation, something most people would overlook. She adjusted it quietly without drawing attention, then moved on, and that was the truth of it. Not dramatic, not loud, not visible to everyone, but constant, the ability to see what others missed and to act on it without needing recognition. Somewhere across the city, Ethan Caldwell stood by another window, his reflection steady, his thoughts clear, not searching for the next deal, not calculating the next move, just observing, understanding in a way he had not allowed himself to before. Because sometimes the most powerful shift does not come from winning, it comes from realizing you have been playing the wrong game all along. And sometimes the person who changes everything is the one no one thought to notice until it was already too late to ignore.